Just going to put a drop of naphtha under there to act as a lubricant to help me slide my scalpel down under that leatherette. That might be a harder to achieve than I hoped. The leatherette's very well stuck. And this stuff is not as pliable or as robust as leatherettes used on later cameras. I want to get it back well past the screw because I don't want to have a sharp crease in the leatherette. I want to be able to roll it back with a fairly large radius. You can see the leatherette's complaining. I'm seeing a few flakes on the surface. It means that it doesn't want to flex that much. How far have I got to get? I'm just about there to the screw. Just put another drop of naphtha under there a bit. Now that's not dissolving adhesive or anything. What it is doing is it's lubricating the scalpel blade. Allowing me to slide it in under that leatherette easy. Okay, I can see the screw quite clearly now. I'll see if I can get to it. Yeah, it's turning. Okay. And there's a single screw at the top. Two screws in the film cassette well at the end here. They're going to need the assistance of a hammer, I think. Alright, that's all they needed, was a little bit of hammer therapy, and the screws came loose. Now I should be able to take the struts out. As you can probably see, they're a bit nasty looking. This arm, the shutter release arm, is quite rusty looking at the end there. It's not very pretty. And we have the return spring for the shutter release, the spacer washer, the clamp for the transfer shaft, and that body is empty now. The felt light trap here is stuck half on this surface and half on here. So I'll peel it off here, get it all glued onto the back of this in one place. It should be good. But I've got to clean out all this filth, that's all sand and corrosion and other rubbish. At this stage, I've got to consider what I hope to achieve with this camera. I don't think it's possible to ever make this a thing of beauty. A lot will depend on what I can do with the lens and shutter. Looking at the diaphragm here, let's open up this shutter. The rear group shouldn't be much more than finger tight, but that certainly wasn't. Well, this lens doesn't look particularly good. I can see big patterns on the coating of the inside surface there. It's like the coating's not there completely. It's only the inside surface, not the outside surface. Now looking here, that diaphragm is not circular. I can move the control, but those blades are not forming a circular pattern. It means that one of the pins is probably out of its pivot point. More than one, quite likely, looking at that. See if they can be nudged back into place. Not without applying so much force that you're likely to damage something. So certainly the lens and shutter leads needs to be attended to before I waste any time on this camera. The spacer ring here is corroded, means the camera's been splashed. When you get an isolated pattern of corrosion like that, it means the camera has been splashed. It means that any other corrosion that you see on the camera is probably not the result of it having been stored somewhere in poor conditions, damp conditions. It means that it's actually been splashed with liquid. So that's not good. Well, I think what I'll do is I will take my mechanical components here, stick them through the ultrasonic cleaner, and while that's happening, strip down this shutter and lens assembly and see if it could be made, if it can be made into a good reliable shutter, then conceivably, and if the lens will clean up, well, that was a clever thing to do, if that lens will clean up and it's not looking promising, then it might be worth putting this camera back together as a working camera that someone could take photos with. If that can't be achieved, if the shutter's no good, I will stop, and this camera can be condemned to be a parts source, and it's not a wonderful parts source because the parts don't look very wonderful. You can probably see the rust on these arms, inside and out, but they still work. They're slightly bent, but potentially that could fix somebody else's camera. Right, more later. Well, cleaning the lens was a bit, it cleaned up. It did clean up. It's not wonderful, but it did clean up. So that really doesn't decide the issue for me. Let's be into the shutter and see what that's like. Well, the shutter release lever there shows a little bit of rust. That's not delightful. Let's find a better pair of tweezers, since I can't see my favourite ones. Oh yes, there they are. Just unhook that spring, unhook that spring, lift out the main lever, lift out the shutter release. Alright, the shutter itself, what's that like? Oh, it's a bit slow. You can see how slow that is to return to the closed position, so the shutter certainly needs to be serviced. Alright, let's take the outer case off. The outer case is held in with 2 screws. And our flash sync wire, which is clamped in place with a tiny screw right here. That was our curved rack falling out. Let's loosen that screw up, get my flash connection off. That's good. This is the detent for our aperture settings. That's the shutter out of the outer casing. Let's start removing things. This is the flash sync mechanism. I'll just remove that screw and its return spring. That's the B lever. Two screws hold the top of our flash sync mechanism in place. That one there forms the pivot for the flash sync settings lever. This sits over 2 posts. And be careful not to lose the spring off that. Two brass spacers. You can unhook that spring from its post. That spring just came loose there from the base of this thing. That holds those 2 pieces together. So we've got to be careful not to lose that spring. Is our moving flash contact. All of this is clamped down by a single screw. There's the high speed spring for our 500th of a second. This is our flash sync cam. Now the teeth on that are a little bit rusty. That's not good. Here are that's the pallet for the pallet wheel here that determines the speed that the flash sync runs down at. I'll remove the tiny black screw that clamped the flash wire in place. There should be a plastic insulator under there, which may or may not be present. There's nothing odd looking about this shutter. It may never have been serviced before. Just push that flash contact out, and the plastic insulator is present inside that flash contact block, so that's good. I can split that case now. There are 3 screws run through the back of the case. Now these run into the mechanism plate, and so they hold the mechanism plate and the shutter case together. Those 3 screws are all the same, so there's no secrets or surprises there. And split the mechanism plate and the shutter blades, will pop those to one side. Now the case here, well, if I look, I can see pivot points for the blades here, 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 here and here and here, but 2 of them, the pivot points are not in place. I'll see if I can slide those blades back into place. I'm just going to slacken these clamp screws down slightly. That's just to release any pressure on here, and I want to see if I can get these blades swung back into position. I can see one of the pivot points right there. That's lined up. I've displaced one more blade while I was doing that. See if I can pull that back into position. Right, I only have one blade out of position now. So that's this one here. I can't see which way it's moved. It must be that one. I'll try moving the settings lever and see if that moves things backwards and forwards enough for me to see the pivot. I can see one blade sticking out further than its mates over here. So that's probably the blade in question. I can see the pivot. See if I can pull that pivot into line with the hole. All the pivots are now in position. So if I do my 3 screws up again, I'm only doing these up lightly, I'm not clamping down hard. Now we have a circular diaphragm again. That moves reasonably smoothly. Those diaphragm blades do not show a lot of sticky oil. So that is an absolute mystery as to how that diaphragm blades came to be knocked out of position. So what are our options there? Well, I do know that the rear lens group was loose. Is it possible that someone took the lens groups off to poke and prod at the diaphragm, perhaps an attempt to clean it, or attempting to clean the shutter blades behind the diaphragm, and knocked the blades out of position? It wouldn't be an easy thing to achieve. But the diaphragm does move. The blades do not look unusually oily. It doesn't feel particularly sticky. That's a weird one. Certainly okay now. And I mean that I've achieved that without dismantling the diaphragm, because I know that worries some people. But I was able to achieve that without dismantling the diaphragm, simply by slightly loosening the 3 screws and then manipulating the blades back into place so that I could see their pivots and get them up through the plate. There are no convincing marks on there to show me what had happened. A mystery. Alright, I'll strip this completely. I know I've got the diaphragm working smoothly now, but the whole shutter really needs to be properly serviced. Why the diaphragm blades were out of position, well, we're probably never going to know. Just remove the 2 screws that hold our settings lever in place. You can get at those 2 screws through holes in the retainer plate here. On earlier Compur shutters you could not. But these ones have a little notch that allows you to get to those 2 screws. So 3 screws hold our retainer plate in place. One of the screws is a countersunk head screw. You'll have no problem working out which one it is and where it goes. There'll be an obvious countersink in the around one of the holes. Okay, so we can tip this lot out. Here's our case, that all needs to be very clean, that's not bad. Here's our moving plate, that'll need to be clean. Here's our rosette of blades, they'll all need to be carefully cleaned. And here's the retainer, likewise that'll need to be cleaned. And everything here I'm just going to clean with naphtha. Nothing complicated, and it's just a tedious 5 or 10 minutes working through cleaning all those blades. You have to be very cautious with the blades. They're quite thin, they're easily damaged. It's easy to catch your cotton bud on them when you're cleaning them, and if you push it back, catch the edge of the blade and buckle the blade up, it is exceptionally hard to get the crease out of the blade at a later date. You don't want to be there, and the best way to avoid having that trouble is be exceptionally careful when you're cleaning those blades. Okay, I can assemble this diaphragm. I cleaned the blades. There are 10 blades, 8 of them were quite clean. 2 of them had a blob of something brown and sticky on them. And I very much suspect that they were the 2 blades that gave me trouble. What was on them, I do not know. Could be a blob of grease that had aged badly. The blades are otherwise unremarkable. They're sitting fairly flat. And that one's not particularly. Now I've got to pull back the earlier blades to get the last few blades in place. Without disturbing things. which is always a bit tricky. Can usually be achieved, not always on the first attempt. That is not lining up. That one's definitely bent up at the end. This is one of those tasks that never gets easy. You just get better practiced at it. And it's probably fair, like most dirty jobs and most trades, it's not that you have a clever way of completing the task that other people shy away from. It's more that you're resigned to your fate and you just get stuck in and do it. Right, so now we're going to lift these blades back over the last few blades. Swing everything back in towards the centre. And hopefully none of those blades are displaced from their holes in the fixed plate. Here's my moving plate, the one that changes the settings for us. And I'm going to get that in the right place. And that's going to take some wriggling to get those blades in position. One there is not lining up. Right, that's looking good. I can lift the cover back over that, and with luck it'll all go smoothly. Get 3 tiny screws. One of them is a countersunk head screw, so I'll get that into the countersunk hole. Run these screws down very lightly. There's always a danger blades have become displaced while you're putting them together, and you don't want to crush a blade between the case and the plates. Okay, so that should be good. Now I'm just looking to make sure that all of the pins are in place and one is not in place here at this point. Right there. Right, I can just see that pin. I'll drag it into position. That looks good. It all dropped into place at that point. I'll tighten these screws down slightly more, just choking up all the slack. Alright, turn it upside down and check to see if the blades all move freely. And they do. We've got a circular opening, so that was a success. I can tighten those 3 screws now. and check again. That's good, it's moving freely. I've got my settings lever here, and I'll just give the back face of that a wipe with some molybdenum paste through the centre and through the back face. This only goes on here one way. The notches in the case go to the top, this goes to the bottom. So I'll line that up. I can see the holes for my shoulder screws through the plate. I'll run one screw into place. I'm supporting this plate from underneath with my fingertips, the settings lever. Get the other screw in place. They're both started. Check that it moves freely. That's good, no problem there. And supporting this on the edge of the wooden block, I can tighten those two screws up. That moves nicely, very controlled, nice and smooth, exactly what we need. So that's our shutter case, and the diaphragm of course done. I'll pop that to one side. I'm going to turn my attention to this. This is the mechanism plate. And I'm going to dismantle this. I'll unhook the spring from that lever, and that lever swings the blade actuating ring backwards and forwards to swing the blades open and closed again. I'll take that off. On this side there are 4 small screws that hold the retainer plate in place. I've put a lot of pressure on the screwdriver to make sure the screwdriver doesn't cam out of the slots and damage things. That's why it's useful to do this on something solid like this wooden block. There are 3 short screws and 1 long screw. I know from experience the long screw will be found here. And of course they have to go back in the right places. Here's our retainer plate with our pallet wheel attached. It'll need to be cleaned. Here is the blade actuating ring that swings the blades open and shut. That's quite dirty, certainly need to be cleaned. And here's the mechanism plate. This will all need to be cleaned. There's quite a bit of old grease and rubbish here. Just checking the action of the retard gear train. That is exceptionally sluggish. It hardly wants to move at all. So that all needs to be flushed with naphtha. Unless I have problems, I never remove the speed train from the plate, because the adjustments at each end here are very awkward to get right. Very, very awkward. Much better if you don't need to. And if you clean it on the plate, you won't need to. I'll put a bit of naphtha into that gear set and I'll work it a few times. Well, you can see immediately that that's moving very promptly, so I've effectively flushed out whatever nuisance was causing a problem there. This I'll need to blow out. we use the blower to blow all that naphtha away, so that as the naphtha goes, it takes with it any contaminants that it's picked up. If you just leave it to dry, the naphtha will evaporate and it'll leave the contaminants exactly where they started, or worse, somewhere else you don't want them to be.